Hi, it's Susan Karasoff. Thank you for joining us tonight for Biggest and Smallest. We are working on restoring native plant diversity in San Francisco. Join our mailing list. We have a monthly speaker series. We have free field trips when it's not a pandemic. We've got biodiversity t-shirts available thanks to Bob Hall. So that benefits California Native Plant Society Yerba Buena chapter. We are looking for volunteers for publicity, coordinators to help post our monthly events and create content, for board members, for newsletter volunteers working on proofreading, working on articles, writing articles from raw material, writing original articles, and initiating a regular column on biodiversity in San Francisco. There are horticulture opportunities, growing native plants from seeds, and we're going to have a fall gardening webinar to help us organize that. There's outdoor opportunities to pull weeds at public gardens, city natural areas, update our website, outreach opportunities to work with me to develop relationships with organizations like Sierra Club and 350.org and Sunrise Movement, and advocate for native plants at City Hall meetings. We need help with graphic designs and doing fashion shoots with our new biodiversity teas. So any help you can give would be appreciated. So next month, September 3rd, Jonathan Young from the Presidio is going to speak about restoring urban nature, how it's a 21st century necessity because more than half the planet lives in cities. And tonight, it's going to be Kipp McMichael talking with us about Biggest and Smallest. Kipp is a web developer with a passion for plants. He has a very large plant collection and a number of degrees, none of which are plant related, but as we all know, the more you work with plants, the more you know about them. So, Kipp, take it away.
All right, welcome everybody. So this the official talk of tonight's, the title of tonight's talk is California's Biggest and Smallest. So hopefully we can certainly discuss maybe at the end of the talk some of the world record holders for the various categories we'll be talking about, but tonight's talk will be focused on California itself and the endemic and native species in California that hold biggest and smallests of various kinds. All right, so let me start sharing my screen. All right, and does that look appropriate for everyone? Can everyone see this this window?
Yes, we can see it. Great.
All right, so as I said, the title of tonight's talk is California's Biggest and Smallests. So we're going to look at some of the maxima and minima in California plants and a few non-plant species that are close enough. So we're going to look at things like biggest trees and smallest seeds and oldest trees, things like that. So let's get started. So the structure of tonight's talk, when it comes to putting something like this together, there are a lot of decisions that should be made. So to sort of ground us around how I went about thinking about this, section 1, sort of to give an overview of what the talk is going to be about. Section 2 is about trees, superlative trees in various ways, tallest, biggest, oldest. Then we'll move on to flowers. After that, we'll move on to other organs and parts that haven't been covered in the previous 2 sections. Finally, we'll move on to things like kinds, so the biggest cactus or the largest algae. And then there's an interesting kind of series of questions that could have been asked in this talk, lots of things that we could speculate about. So that maybe if we have time for it, we can kind of get into more of a discussion like that. All right, so when it comes to a discerning audience of native plant enthusiasts, you're probably rather detail-oriented and you're wondering when I say biggest and smallest, like who's determining this and when and how are these decisions being made? And that's a great question because a lot of these questions are not easy. For instance, let's just talk about questions about trees if we want to talk about biggest or oldest tree. Well, the most interesting question at first is, what do we mean when we talk about a tree? Trees are, like a lot of plants, very flexible organisms, so they can be cut up and divided and continue on with their lives and continue to grow. So here we're looking at the tree of 100 horses. This is a sweet chestnut, Castanea sativa, grows in Sicily. This one has a bit of a historical interest because at some point there was an army, you know, the warmongering past is alive in the lifetime of this tree, and a procession of 100 soldiers, knights with horses, and the noble woman who was guiding them all spent a night under this tree during a storm. So apparently since that time, however, parts of the tree have died and it is now separate trees. At its maximum, a couple hundred years ago, apparently it was measured and had a girth of 190 feet. So a rather giant tree. But these days, if you looked at it, you would think it was 3 separate trees. It does share a common root system, but the trunks are no longer united, and it's unclear how much of any of this trunk material is as old as the tree. So this might be a case of something called a clonal tree. And if we move on, we can get another example of this in the mythical banyan tree, the mythical and the real banyan tree, as it were. So Ficus Bengalensis, this one happens to be in Howrah, India. There are many great banyans in India. This may not be the largest. They are always growing, of course, too, so that ranking probably changes over time. But this one is in a park. This is from a distance. This is underneath the edge of this tree. As you can see, it looks like its own forest. This is another example of a clonal tree, though in this case, it's a little clearer that this all started out as the same tree, and slowly the branches have dropped off roots. However, in natural circumstances, a banyan like this could easily expand across the landscape and basically become divided over time, so that you may not know, unless you did some sort of particular analysis, if this was all the same tree. If we take a movement like this in over a long period of time in a slightly different direction with a different species, this is Pondo, a quaking aspen in Utah. So more or less the entire forest of green trees you see here extending up this hillside and going off in both directions in this valley and off away from the images. This is one single tree. So this is a clonal tree of a quaking aspen, Populus tremuloides. It's a very common species, and it's clonal across all of its range. This is the largest one that has so far been discovered, and it is indeed the largest clonal tree that we know of. It is an extremely old tree as well. We'll talk about that in a minute. All right, so when we talk about oldest, there are lots of claims to the oldest trees. Here, for example, is one of the more recent claimants to the title of oldest, and this one is a Norway spruce, Old Tico. This one grows in Dalarna, Sweden, and while this tree, to look at it, doesn't seem like it's very old at all, that's actually true. What you're looking at is a fairly recent shoot. So this shoot may be a century old or less. In this climate, trees grow very slowly, so even small trees can be old, but this one is particularly tiny and not particularly old. However, research on this tree using genetic analysis of dead tree parts that have been found beneath the tree and examining the tree itself have shown that this is a clonal tree as well. So this individual tree over time will grow leaders like this that will have a single branch or one or more branches. Those will over time get old, die, be knocked over, but the root system remains alive, and lower branches eventually spawn another leader that then takes over and grows up, and the cycle repeats. So, so far the tree, given the remains of this tree that have been found, is 9,500 years old. But this is also an example of a clonal tree in the sense that not a single actual tree, a trunk with branches and leaves, ever persists for a long period of time. We'll get to some examples of non-clonal trees in the tree section. And then here's yet another example of a clonal tree, the Sangarneve yew. That's a Welsh word that tend to be tongue twisters, both to read and to say. And this one is purported to be 4,000 years old. It's probably not 4,000 years old. That is the claim, however, but it may very well be at least 1,000 years old. There seems to be pretty good evidence for that given the age of the churchyard that it's in. But this is a yew tree, and if the legend or the story about it is to be believed, it started out as a single tree that has now grown so large that like that 100-horse chestnut we saw earlier, has now split off into a couple of different trunks. All right. Oh, and my mistake. Let me pop back in there. And then finally, we're back to Pondo again, that quaking aspen. If Pondo has been around, and growing sort of at a more or less steady pace, given the area that it's in and the way the climate has worked over the last eons, then Pondo could be around 80,000 years old as a clonal tree. So certainly Pondo is, as far as we know, by far the oldest sort of individual tree organism that exists on the earth. But that one's not in California. All right. So that was just an example of trying to talk about some of these questions around oldest or biggest, or even what a tree itself is, and how hard those can be. So those kinds of questions come up in all kinds of areas in the plant world. And so I'm going to be shamelessly sticking to the low-hanging fruit as far as that goes. I picked easy categories. I was both arbitrary and capricious. Some of the plant categories we'll be focusing on, are just things that interest me or that I have a particular knowledge of. And then other things, could be equally interesting to find out about. I just didn't happen to include them in the talk. And that will be more fodder for our discussion at the end. And then, as in all the talks that I give the Native Plant Society, I shamelessly borrow from the internet for all kinds of content. Many of these images are mine, but many of these images are not. Probably most of the better ones are not. And you may see your own images in this talk if they happen to be on the internet. So if they are, speak up, and I'll happily give you some credit. All right, so let's get ourselves started with the biggest and smallest tree category. So when it comes to biggest and smallest, especially biggest, the conifers really dominate the superlatives in the tree form when it comes to plants. The biggest and the tallest and the oldest and the widest and a whole bunch of other kinds of categories are all dominated by the conifers. One of the things that I wanted to do to sort of gamify and kind of add a little bit of fun to the talk is to let people have a moment to try to guess the answers to these categories before I open them up. So I'm going to start with the biggest conifer. This one's what I would call fairly easy. It's what a lot of people would probably know it if they pay attention to tree trivia. So I'll give it an open in a moment. You can let me see here. Let me try to open the chat so I can at least see what that looks like. But I don't think it's oh, here we go. All right, it is letting me open the chat. Give me just a moment to rearrange my screen a bit. All right, yes. Okay. So, as a few people guessed, giant sequoia is indeed Sequoia dendron giganteum. This is a picture of me on a very large sequoia in the Freeman Grove in Sequoia National Forest. So this grove is one of the southernmost groves. It's near Camp Nelson, California. I believe the George W. Bush tree is the most notable tree in this grove. Despite what you may think about the president, the trees in the grove are fantastic. This is a particularly outstanding specimen here. This is not the George W. Bush tree itself. This is a different tree. There are wonderful groves here, and it is really just an amazing tree. In another forest, all of the trees in the foreground of this image would be quite sizable and impressive, and yet amongst the sequoias, they are tiny. General Sherman happens to be the biggest sequoia tree in the world as an individual specimen. They are indeed enormous. And as you can see here, General Sherman, here's just a pulled from Wikipedia table. The tree is a rather large tree at 52,000 board feet. You can see, and that board feet is a measure of trunk volume. And so when we look back at the cubic meters of the giant sequoia, you can see that they really are in a class by themselves. The next ranking species, the redwoods, come in considerably smaller. All right. Now, when it comes to tallest, I'll give people a moment to guess in the room for tallest tree. And remember, we're sticking in conifers here. All right. And as many people probably guessed, the coastal redwoods, Sequoia sempervirens. So just to talk for a moment, to digress a bit about sequoia and giant sequoia and redwood. So obviously these names seem somewhat confusing because we call it a giant sequoia and we call the redwood a sequoia as its genus. And the giant sequoia is Sequoia dendron. So this goes back to the complicated interaction of scientists and scientific research and the history of identification of these trees. And so the complicated story condensed is that once upon a time, they were all together in sequoia. Then eventually they were divided up. It was realized that giant sequoias were very different from redwoods, despite the fact that they are similar in many ways. Especially if you look at the top foliage of a coastal redwood, it looks almost identical to a sequoia's foliage. But they divided those up, and so they needed a new genus for the sequoia tree, and a previous genus that had been assigned, Wellingtonia, had been taken by another plant, and so it was given Sequoia dendron. So that's why we call giant sequoias Sequoia dendron, and we call redwoods sequoias. But yes, the Sequoia sempervirens is the tallest tree, and it is beautiful. These are some images from the Tall Trees Grove, and this is an image from Redwood Creek looking back at the Tall Trees Grove at some of the tallest trees in that grove. And again, like the sequoia, the redwood is in a class by itself when it comes to height. There are many trees that are very, very, very tall, but the redwood stands quite a bit above the tallest of the rivals.
Hey Kipp,
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt. Your browser is showing at the top, so I'm not sure if you're completely full screen.
All right, I will do that. That may help. All right. All right, so now we will come to smallest conifer. So people can guess while I chat a bit about the smallest conifer. So unlike the biggest and the tallest, the smallest conifer is a little bit more of an open question. There are probably lots of potentially dwarfed trees in alpine areas, the so-called Krumholtz areas where the trees are very tiny and grow prostrate against the ground. But in my case, I picked two interesting ones to talk about. Oops, that is not the one. Sorry to have exposed one of them, but it was an easy one too, so most people probably know that one. So as far as smallest conifer, I would first give the candidate as Juniperus communis, and that should be communis rather than communia. Sorry for the mis-ID there at the top. This is the prostrate juniper. It grows in the Sierra. It also grows in the Siskiyou Mountains at elevation. It's a rather interesting little juniper. This one basically is prostrate. It stretches along the ground. Juniperus communis is a rather largely distributed tree, and so in some places it is actually a tree. It can grow to bush size and potentially even larger. But in California, you usually find it's something that doesn't get much more above ankle height in most places. For other tiny conifers in California, you would probably want to go to the pygmy forests on the north coast in Mendocino County and areas nearby. Hesperocyparus pygmaea is one of the tiny ones that's there. This tree happens to be about hip height, but coning individuals are easily found that are, a foot, 14, 18 inches tall. And in addition, Pinus contorta subspecies Bolanderi is another, the lodgepole pine of the Mendocino Plain. This picture is actually not of a Bolanderi. For some reason, I could not find a decent picture of a small one. This one's a Pinus contorta from a bog in British Columbia. So this is not, strictly speaking, the Bolanderi, but it looked the ones that I've seen in habitat that sadly I did not take a picture of at the time look very much like this. All right, so when it comes to oldest conifer, this again, let's see. All right, so somebody's saying they can't see the full screen. Are other people having a problem with seeing the full screen?
Are some of your images meant to be small? There's like a black box at the bottom. And
yes, so some images are definitely small. That's just the resolution of the images that
they're not blowing up to full screen then.
yeah. So some don't blow up to full screen and some do. It depends on the size of the image. I'll see if I can use my magnifier to make those larger for you the next time I bring up an image for the smaller ones. All right, so for the oldest, generally speaking, that's a one that's pretty well known. Pinus longiva, the bristlecone pine, the Great Basin bristlecone pine specifically for that common name. So in the White Mountains in California, you will find groves of these at very high elevation. It's an amazing habitat. The trees grow on a dolomite-dominated soil, and this excludes most plants that would grow with them otherwise. You don't see really many other trees here at all. There's a grassland slightly below most of the groves of these trees, and then almost as if they were mulched with gravel, the dolomite gravel begins, and the groves of the trees take over the rest of the top of the mountain. These picturesque trees are probably not images of the oldest one. The location of the so-called Methuselah tree is not actually shared, so we don't really know where it is. This is a picture of the largest. Let me see if I can increase the size a bit. This is a picture of the largest bristlecone pine. It is also certainly not the oldest. In fact, the largest trees tend to not be the oldest trees in most tree species. Giant sequoias might be an exception, might be the only exception to that. All right, and the bristlecone pine is also quite pretty. The cones are truly this amazing blue color when they first come out. These are the female cones. You can see the bristles that give it its name just starting. All right, so from superlatives when it comes to the whole tree, we can talk about cones. So the biggest cones. There are arguably two answers to this question, so I'll give people a moment to try that out in the chat room. You can keep track of your performance and congratulate yourself at the end for how well you've done. So I would put the top when asking the question about the biggest cone as the coulter pine as opposed to the sugar pine. Coulter pines are nearly as long as sugar pines and they are considerably heavier. Coulter pines can easily weigh 10 pounds for the largest cones. Obviously, that weight is going to vary depending on whether it's a fresh, fairly green cone or an ancient cone that's dried out completely. But these cones are rather gigantic. This image is, I would say, an average size coulter pine cone. I would not even call this a particularly large one. The coulter pine tree itself, despite the fact that it has giant cones, is not a particularly large pine tree. It's certainly not the largest pine tree in California. That record goes to sugar pine, which happens to have the longest cones of any tree in California. So here we have an image of a sugar pine cone. That's a young woman's hand, so it's not a full adult-sized hand, but it is nonetheless a very large cone. They can be about 22 inches long at their maxima. They might even be able to be longer than that. Rather amazing. And they grow on, as I said, the largest pine tree in California as well. And rather picturesquely, they tend to hang out at the very edges of those branches. I don't see one hanging on the image of this tree, but it's almost as if the tree picks the furthest point to drop off these giant cones and let them hang. That certainly probably helps with wind dispersal of the seeds when that happens. And here's an example of the comparative pine cones of California. These obviously are not examples of the truly, this is an example of record-setting examples of each of these. These are just comparative, comparative showing of those pine cones. So you can see that 16 is the coulter pine and 20 is the sugar pine. So the coulter pine is almost as long and considerably bigger, and in structure itself, the coulter pine, is probably 4 or 5 times as massive as the sugar pine. All right, and so now for smallest cones, maybe somebody, I'll give you a moment to guess the smallest cones. you can see the bristlecone pine blue color early in the season when the cones are forming, and the cones tend to be forming when I have been there in summer. But considering how slowly the cones form, I'm not sure. You know, they may be blue for months longer. You know, they may be blue in late winter and in late summer. But I've been there, you know, around the 4th of July and seen those blue-colored cones. Somebody asked about the pine cones. Number 17 is the gray pine, Pinus sabiniana. It's also called the ghost pine. Its cones, I have seen Pinus sabiniana cones that are considerably larger than the one in this image that certainly rival Coulter pine cones, though they don't get quite as long. But it's another big one. And that one's in the close by in the Bay Area. All right, so for the smallest cones, interestingly enough, we're back to the redwood, Sequoia sempervirens. It has an extremely tiny cones. These are female cones. The male cones of a Sequoia sempervirens are even smaller. I don't have an image of those. I didn't even think to put an image until just at this moment. So, but yeah, so despite the fact that it is one of the larger trees in the world, its cones are very tiny and its tiny seeds are spread by the wind. Male and female cones on pine trees. So what we call pine cones are typically the female cones. So the male cones are usually much tinier than the female cones. They're often, they look more like a pipe cleaner almost, or something, you know, like a small hot dog or something, you know, strange like that. They tend to be much more ephemeral as well. So the male cones will frequently only be on the tree for a few weeks or months of the season, whereas female cones on most trees will stay on for at least a season or two. In the case of Sequoia, cones can stay on the tree for decades. And there are other trees in California, the closed cone pines. Likewise, the pine cones can stay attached to the tree so long that the trunk will completely enclose them. So male and female cones, and generally the female cones, as I said, get larger. So the cones of the bristlecone that we looked at earlier, that was a female cone. Right. Okay, so when it comes to trees, as I said, the conifers really dominate the superlative categories in terms of height and width. So to spice up the tree category, I decided to break out some of the other categories, and so we can look at dicots of California. So non-conifer trees, what we would call a broadleaf tree. So the tallest broadleaf tree in California. Oh, actually, you know what? I missed the last image. Somebody asked about the hemlocks. So I missed the last image in my list. And so the western hemlock is certainly a rival for the smallest cone. They are often smaller than redwoods. I have certainly seen the smallest redwood cone I have seen was smaller than the smallest hemlock cone, but that could certainly probably be argued. It would be an interesting research to try to actually prove that. And I'm hoping that this talk will inspire some people to do some actual research here and go out in the field. Some of these superlatives are fairly well established by data, and some of these superlatives are not. And so it'll be interesting to see if people have some different ideas about some of my options. Thanks, Mike, for reminding me about my other smallest cone. All right, so when it comes to the tallest dicot, so this would be a broadleaf tree. So these are things like maples and oaks and things like that. So if anybody wants to guess, they should do it now. So when it comes to the tallest dicot native California tree, we come to the valley oak, Quercus lobata. Here we see it in probably the late winter or the early spring before its leaves have come out. This is an image, a small image. I will magnify it as best I can. Of a particularly large Quercus lobata near Covelo, California. Interestingly, this tree is not included in a superlative trees list that I was able to find. So I'm wondering if this may not, this was noted by the person whose blog post I was reading here, and obviously this image shows a truly enormous tree. But interestingly enough, I couldn't find any stats about this particular tree. But it is an example of Quercus lobata, which is certainly the largest dicot tree in California. Right. I see there's a question about what is a superlative. So superlative just means the biggest of something or the largest, the top end of a scale, the superlative. I see a couple of other questions here about large cones. So when it comes to large cones, the advantages of having large cones, it's an interesting question when it comes to the coulter pine. It's unclear why that pine needs such tough large cones. Perhaps there are issues with seed predators. In the case of those pine trees to protect their seeds. When it comes to the sugar pine, that may just be a case of it being a very, very large tree, and hence it can afford to have comparatively large cones as well. Otherwise, its cones are very lightweight. They stay closed until heat or fire help to open them up, and then they release their seeds. And so presumably smaller cones could work just as well, but the sugar pine has, given its size, can afford larger cones. Smaller sugar pine trees will have smaller cones. So sometimes the sugar pine trees, cones are not especially large at all. But when you get to the largest examples and the largest trees, that's where you get those record-sized cones. All right. So the talk that I'm giving is just about California native trees. I apologize that the original title that was given out in the press for this was just biggest and small. So this is not a a worldwide ranking, just the stuff in California. As it turns out, California happens to have the world's superlatives when it comes to biggest tree and tallest tree and oldest tree. But we, and actually when it comes to largest pine cone and longest pine cone, we also have superlatives there as well. But for the most of these other categories, other trees in the world are certainly superior. All right, so back to the dicots. When we're talking about the widest dicot. So this is an interesting one I was somewhat surprised by. So the bay laurel, Umbellularia californica. And this is the champion tree. It's down in Palo Alto. And I don't actually, let me see, I had the circumference for that. But I don't have it in my notes, unfortunately. I believe that this is 30 meters, if I'm not mistaken, but a very large tree. All right, and so when it comes to trees and their nuts, so what might be the largest nut in California? Give people a second to guess that. All right, so the largest nut in California is produced by the buckeye. So the California buckeye, Aesculus californica, here is an example of an extremely large buckeye in San Francisco. It's one of the landmark trees of the city. Someone's lucky enough to have this in their side and front yard. And as you can see, the bucknut is rather substantial. The one that is in the person's hand, I would say, is an example of a good-sized one. I've seen some that were even larger. The size of, and so these nuts are also poisonous. The Indians used to use these. They would crush them up and throw them into creeks to stun fish. All right, and as I said, if I didn't break out dicots from conifers, we wouldn't have had any other trees but conifers to talk about for tallists and widest. And if I didn't break out monocots from dicots, we wouldn't have some interesting tallest and widest trees to talk about. So the tallest monocot in California. People want to guess in the room, they can. This is an interesting one. In the meantime, I'll just note, someone asked about how female and male cones interact. So in most conifers, the cones are female cones are wind pollinated. So the pollen is picked up by the wind and deposited on the female. There's a little tiny droplet of liquid that actually does the job of catching the pollen in conifers. Now, not every conifer is that way. A very unusual conifer, the Welwitschia in South Africa, is actually pollinated by beetles, but most of them are pollinated by wind. And buckeyes are related to chestnuts. And somebody's asking about what a monocot is. So monocots are, roughly speaking, plants that have a single leaf in their seedling stage. And dicots are plants that have 2 leaves in their seedling stage. And so this is our, in their embryonic stage inside their seed. So dicots are most of the familiar plants that you think of when you think of things that aren't grasses, and monocots are mostly grasses, and then other things like orchids, various kinds of other plants along those lines. And for the tallest one, for instance, palm trees. So the tallest monocot in California is Washingtonia filifera, the California fan palm. A eudicot is a grouping of the dicots. So basically, there's a complicated taxonomy for plants, and it gets more complicated every day. And eudicots are a very large grouping of plants that that in an older time might have been called dicots, but it's a slightly more refined grouping. But that's all I'll say about that. So the Washingtonia, the fan palm, here it is in a habitat rather than under cultivation. This is in an oasis in Anza Borrego. All right, and the widest monocot in California. Anyone care to guess that? I was actually impressed by this answer because I had assumed that both the tallest and the widest monocot would have been the California fan palm. But instead, it's the Joshua tree. Unfortunately, the title of the widest Joshua tree is no longer shared by a living specimen. This was the largest Joshua tree in California. It was popular enough to be a landmark and to appear on postcards. Unfortunately, as you can see in this image, there is a rather large gash in this tree's trunk. Here's an image from further away with people near it. And then finally, an old car for perspective on the size of the trunk. A truly gigantic tree. Unfortunately, over time, people cut pieces of the trunk out, and eventually the tree was set on fire and burned. So a sad fate for one of the more impressive trees in California. The reality of most giant trees in California is that they will eventually burn one day, frequently by human hands. Sadly, this was an example of that. All right, well, that concludes the tree section. Landscapers do use California fan palms fairly frequently. They are pretty popular. Other palm trees are a little bit better in terms of their, they might have a different leaf structure. California fan palms can be very prickly and they're slow growing enough that it takes a long time for them to sort of get out of the way of being a yard plant. But they are still quite popular and they're growing so in popularity. All right, so now biggest and smallest when it comes to flowers. So this is flowers and flowering parts. All right, so the largest flower in California. Does anybody have any guesses for the largest flower in California? All right, the Matalyeha poppy, Rhamnea coulteri. Wonderful Southern California native, though these days you will find it planted all over California, and in fact, it can be planted basically almost all over the world. It dies back to the ground in extremely cold climates, but people cultivate it in Canada and in England, all over the place. The blooms of this plant can be up to 8 inches across, especially when the wrinkly petals happen to finally completely unfurl and fluff out. This is an example of the tree in habitat. All right, so from largest flower, we can move on to largest inflorescence. So inflorescence is the organ of the plant that gives rise to flowers. So in many plants, the inflorescence is just the immediate small stem of the flower itself. But in some plants, flowers grow on the plant in larger organs. There are many different kinds of inflorescences, umbels and scapes and all kinds of others, sprays. And so the inflorescence is that organ. So now one could perhaps argue that an entire plant is an inflorescence since, the purpose of the plant is to grow and give rise to flowers in the case of flowering plants. But inflorescence here is an organ that is specifically for flowering and does not appear and does not last unless, the flowers are present. So the largest inflorescence in California is back to our California native palm. Its inflorescence can be up to 10 meters long. These in the picture, of course, not that long at all. There are extremely long examples in records. There are certainly, however, rivals for this, given particular plants and examples of them. So agave deserti, a native agave to California, is also a very large inflorescence. So in the case of this plant, it's what's called monocarpic. Monocarpic means single-bodied, but the real meaning of the term means a plant that blooms once and then dies. In the case of this agave, the individual head, so the middle collection of spines here is one rosette of the agave. That head will die after it produces these flowers. So many agaves are monocarpic. Many bromeliads, relatives of the pineapple, are monocarpic. There are a few different kinds of plants that are. And in addition, another agave relative, the yucca, or in this case, the Hespero yucca whipplei, also known as Our Lord's Candle, is another giant inflorescence. Not quite as tall as the agave, and neither of these are quite as long as the fan palm can get, but still very impressive. Hespero yucca whipplei is also surprisingly widely distributed in California. You can see it everywhere. It looks as if you would only find it in the desert, but you can find it in hot and dry places all over, in Big Sur, in the Sierra, in Kings Canyon. You can find it in the northern parts of California, close to the Bay Area as well. It is a very interesting plant in the landscape, and clearly rather impressive when in bloom. All right, so the smallest flowering plant. Any guesses for the smallest flowering plant in California? And when it comes to the smallest flowering plant in California, it's shared with the world as well. The smallest flowering plant in California is duckweed. Here we see two different species of duckweed, a larger and a smaller one. Lemna and Lemnoidea species. There are multiple species of duckweed, some introduced and some native. Here is a zoom onto a very tiny duckweed flower. And here is an example of a male and female duckweed flower. Tiny, 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 tiny on the tiny plants. So duckweed has the distinction of being both the tiniest flowering plant and it has the tiniest flowers as well. All right, so the plant with the fewest flowers, obviously that could be argued as being 0, and hence all of the gymnosperms, the pine trees, and the ginkgos and all the other plants that don't have flowers have no flowers at all. But the next smallest, of course, would be 1 flower. And as it were, many plants have a single flower, but a particularly charismatic example is the Calypso Orchid, a native of California. It's also native to the Pacific coast, forests along the Pacific coast going north into Canada. These images are from Mount Tam. You can't find it. It's in the Santa Cruz Mountains south of the Bay Area, but that's the southernmost extent. So if you want to see it, you can find it in the Santa Cruz Mountains and on Mount Tam. A gorgeous little plant. Each one has a single flower. It has a single green leaf that grows during the winter, and then in around March or so, it puts off a stem with a flower. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful native flower. All right, so that finishes our flowers category. And so now we move on to biggest and smallest organs and parts of plants. So we talked about a few different things like nuts and cones and flowers before. And so this category includes the other parts of the plants we haven't hit so far. So seeds, and so seeds for this category is a plant that, a seed that is not a nut. So the tree nuts are the superlatives here. They dominate. So if we were to rank the tree nuts, you would have the buckeye, of course, at the top. But then walnuts would also come in after that, and many acorns. But for non-trees, the largest seed, I'll give people a moment to guess that while I take a drink of water. So this, the holder of the largest seed, will be a site we're going to see again in this talk, and that is the manroot, the Mara species. So Mara species are cucurbits. They're relatives of cucumbers and squash and pumpkins. They have a large tuber, and they produce a very spiny fruit. It looks a lot like a small round cucumber with spikes all over it. And inside that fruit are just a few, in most cases, 4 or 8, but not very many, very large seeds. You can see here the large seeds of the manroot. There are about 5 species that are native to California. All of the species except for one that exist are native to California, and a couple of them are endemic. All of them have very large seeds. This is the fruit of the Mara oregonus in this case. This one is a native to San Francisco and the Bay Area, though it's the less common of the species. The common one in the Bay Area is Mara fabaceus, the California manroot, and here's some images of Mara oregonus as well. All right, the smallest seeds. Anyone want to guess the smallest seeds in California? All right. I see someone guessed duckweed or chia. So the smallest seeds are actually orchids. Even in the case of duckweed, the seeds are slightly larger. So orchids are an interesting group of plants. And this is a Spiranthes, a lady's trusses orchid, a native of California. This is the beautiful California lady slipper, Cypripedium californicum. This is another beautiful Epipactis gigantea. This is normally a green plant, but particular populations in an area called the Cedars near Occidental California have a really gorgeous dark red coloration across the plant and the flowers. And this is one of my favorite California native plants, Goodyeara oblongifolia, the Rattlesnake Plantain, as it is called. Its flowers are very similar to the Spiranthes that we saw at the start. Orchid seeds are the tiniest because orchids have a very unusual way of handling the early stages of their life. Orchids have dispensed with putting extra nutrients in their seeds at all. Their seed is a tiny dust-like individual embryo, and that embryo has basically no reserves. It has just enough food inside it to sprout, and hopefully that embryo immediately finds a fungal hyphae, a thread of a piece of fungus. And if it does, it will immediately start parasitizing the fungus. So the beautiful orchids that we all love all start out as parasites in their early life. They steal nutrients from fungi. And then once they are big enough to start producing leaves, then of course they do have photosynthesis and they're able to fix their own nutrients, and they begin a trading partnership with the fungi around them in which they trade carbohydrates for the minerals and support that the fungi give them. But early in an orchid's life, it is pulling all of its nutrients, carbohydrates, and other minerals and nutrients alike from fungi and giving nothing in return. All right, so now we'll move on to plant parts. So the largest leaf. A guess for the largest leaf in California. It's a plant we've already seen. All right, we're back to the California fan palm. So again, some superlatives. We have the tallest monocot and the longest inflorescence, and also now the largest leaf. The California fan palm, of course, the reason it has the largest leaf is the unique leaf morphology of the palm tree. Includes not only the large fan itself, but this extremely large petiole, or I think it's a rhapis when it comes to palm trees. So yep, and there's an example of one in life. If we were to exclude palm trees from our ranking, the next largest trees would be actually ferns. So ferns sort of specialize in producing most of their material as a leaf, a frond, much like palm trees. And so here is a Woodwardia fimbriata. It's the giant chain fern, another California native. Its leaves can be 2 to 3 meters long. And if we were to exclude ferns and palms, the next largest leaf would be the skunk cabbage. So Lysochiton americanus. These are bog inhabitants. You'll find them in the North Coast amongst the redwoods. There's a nice patch of them at Golden Gate Park's Botanical Garden in their redwood section. All right, the largest fruit in California. Any guesses for the largest fruit in California? The largest fruit in California, if we weren't excluding non-natives, would of course be the giant pumpkins that you see measured on the backs of trucks in Half Moon Bay in the fall. But if we're going with California natives, pumpkins are excluded, but a close relative of pumpkin happens to be it. So this is the coyote melon, Cucurbita palmetta. Cucurbita pepo is the pumpkin. And so Cucurbita palmetta is a sibling in that genus. And this one grows out in the desert, southern and southeastern California. I think there are some records of it in the Central Valley as well. It intergrades with a couple, there's Cucurbita digitata, Cucurbita palmetta, and Cucurbita fetidissima that are all native to California. And interesting, they have a variation of leaf shape. Fetidissima has a diamond shape, palmetta has this star shape, and then digitata has an extremely, almost like finger-like shape on each of its lobes. And so these fruit can be up to about 6 inches in diameter. They are mostly hollow on the inside with a whole bunch of seeds. All right, and the largest tuber in California. All people guess on that. So the Cucurbita palmetta is not edible. It's not something, if you tried to eat it, it would be very bitter and unpleasant. Cucurbits are generally soaked with an alkaloid, a soapy material called cucurbitacin. And actually, much like the buckeye fruit, the Indians also used to crush up manroot, which happens to be the largest tuber in California, as people are guessing. They would crush up manroot seeds and manroot tubers and throw those into rivers and stuff to stun fish as well. So here's a manroot tuber. This one just happens to be a random image that I was able to find. The largest manroot tubers have not been uncovered or pictured, unfortunately. This one happens to weigh about 400 pounds. This is not an especially large manroot. Once upon a time, I was fascinated by manroot and traveled around the state to collect their seeds. And if I was able, because manroot are very common plants where you find them, I would sometimes take a small tuber as well. And so that usually, involved following a vine into the ground and then unearthing where the tuber was underneath it. And so I was on the side of the freeway in LA near Griffith Park looking for manroot. And I found a vine and traced it to the ground and started unearthing its tuber. And I was on a slope. And as I unearthed the tuber, I rapidly realized that I was in fact standing on the tuber and that it extended around me in every direction for about 3 or 4 feet in the ground. So the tuber was probably about the size of a Volkswagen Bug. These can get to be enormous. There was apparently a branched tuber of the manroot that arched over the entrance to the Santa Ana Botanical Garden in Southern California for some years. All right. All right, so there's a question about the smallest fruit. The smallest fruit is a good question. I don't know what might be a good answer to that. Not every plant makes a fruit, and so some plants have very, very tiny flowers and very, very tiny seeds inside them. So I don't know, it sort of would depend on how you might rank the organs or how you might classify some of those organs. But that is an interesting question. Maybe we can speculate on that at the end of the talk. All right, so after we've talked about trees and flowers and plant parts, this is a category, kind of a grab bag of various categories and subcategories of kinds of plants. This is the arbitrary and capricious part that I mentioned at the beginning. There are many different kinds of plants one could ask about what the tallest and smallest are. I have particular interest in some of these, so I included them here, and hopefully you'll find them interesting as well. So we'll start with the biggest fern. That's probably an easy one since we already hit it up. Good old chain fern. 2 to 3 meter fronds. Very substantial fern. Meeting it in the landscape, it is usually much larger than you are. The largest fruit in California was Cucurbita palmetta. It was the pumpkin relative. All right, the smallest fern in California. Do we have any guesses as to the smallest fern in California? You would most likely see the smallest fern in California alongside one of the other ferns that we saw, one of the other small plants that we saw earlier. Interestingly enough, the smallest fern and the smallest non-fern plants go together. The smallest fern in California is Azolla. It is an aquatic fern that grows on the surface of the water. This image here is magnified a good bit. The plants, the individual plants here, the individual branches of the plant are probably on the order of about 1 millimeter or 2. You have seen Azolla undoubtedly in the California landscape. You just may not have known it. In freshwater areas, if you've ever seen a pink-topped pond or a ditch, that was Azolla. There are a couple of species in California, Azolla folliculoides and Azolla microphylla, both of which are tiny. Azolla are also fascinating because they have an association with bacteria that allow Azolla to fix nitrogen. They supply they grow special organs in their tissue that allow bacteria to colonize it, and the environment allows bacteria to fix atmospheric nitrogen and turn it into nitrogen that plants can use. And nitrogen that's been turned into the form that plants can use can be used by all the other animals as well. So Azolla is an important fixer of nitrogen in wetland habitats. There's some interesting speculations about a time in the history of the Earth in which there was such a large Azolla population that it actually changed the climate. You can search for interesting videos about that on YouTube. The smallest fern in California. All right, so for cacti, let's talk about the biggest and smallest cacti in California. I'll give people a moment to guess. You may be surprised to know what the biggest cactus in California is. So the saguaro is actually the biggest cactus in California. You may think that saguaros are confined to Arizona, but in fact, they make it just across the Colorado River in southeastern California in a few spots. This is an image of one of those populations. And the smallest cactus in California is the fishhook cactus. So it's usually under 6 inches long. It can be considerably smaller than that. These here are about 1.5 inches to 2 inches tall. Those interesting red organs are the fruit. Some small flowers come up on these, and then they're replaced by these neat little red sausages. All right, so another interesting group of plants in California, one that fascinates me, I've given a talk to the CNPS about it before as well, are parasitic plants and plants that are unable to make their own food. So the biggest parasitic plant in California. Anyone have a guess as to what the biggest parasitic plant in California might be? Mistletoe is something that you might think, but a very unusual California native, Crameria erecta. So this is a shrub of the desert, and it's a rather fascinating plant. Its roots touch the roots of all the plants around it, and it steals nutrients from them. So it's similar to a variety of other plants that grow in California, Indian paintbrush, Indian warrior, various other groups of that. Owl clover is another example. So these are plants that do have their own chlorophyll. They make their own food. They can create their own food just like other plants, but they also get by with a little help from their friends. And in this case, it's stolen from the plants around them. Crameria have gorgeous flowers, a very interesting zygomorphic flower shape, and these prickly fruit that are indeed designed to catch onto furry animals and feathered animals so that the plant can spread itself around. All right, and the smallest parasitic plant in California. These categories are certainly harder. I would not have known these answers if I hadn't been into parasitic plants for a while myself. You may not have ever seen the smallest parasitic plant in California. is called Pilostyles. Pilostyles is a relative of the cucurbits. So the manroot and the pumpkins that we talked about earlier, this is a relative of those. It is a parasitic plant that grows inside other plants. So in this case, it's growing in desert shrubs. Oops. Oh, sorry, let me get back to that. This is leguminous shrub that it's growing in. The plant actually grows as a tiny bit of tissue that grows inside the stem of the plant, and it keeps pace with the bud at the ends of the branches and grows along with them. So if you were to cut this branch open and look at it under a microscope, you may not even be able to see the individual tiny filamental cells that make up the plant. But then at some point in its life cycle, those cells start to aggregate into larger, start to grow larger organs, and eventually little tiny flowers erupt out of the branches. And you can see here the tiny bloom of the Pilostyles. All right. The Pilostyles happens to grow on a couple of bushes. So here, let me open that back up again and I'll show it to you. So the one that's growing on it here is called Sorofamis Amorii. And I'm not certain about this plant that it's growing on. It is another one of the desert plants, you know, the extremely glaucous desert plants. I don't think it's the Sorofamis though. All right. All right, and the biggest non-photosynthetic plant. So non-photosynthetic plants are not always parasitic on other plants, but they are always parasitic or on something. So a non-photosynthetic plant can't make its own food, and so it's at the mercy of other plants and fungi to get its food. And so in the case of the biggest non-photosynthetic plant in California, pine drops, Pterospora andromedea, a rather beautiful little plant that's related to blueberries. This plant lives most of its life cycle as a root mass in the ground. That root mass has connections with the fungi all around it, and those fungi have connections with the trees in the forest. So this plant is indirectly pulling nutrients from the trees. It has somehow tricked the fungus into a one-way trade. Normally fungi interface with plants and the two sides swap nutrients. In the case of pine drops, it doesn't appear to be the case that the pine drops give anything back to the fungus, and yet the fungus continues to share with the pine drops. It's an interesting question that's still under research. And here you can see the fruiting body of the pine drops after the blooms have matured. They're little tiny, very fine seeds here that get spread around in the forest floor. And much like orchids, these seeds need to very quickly, when they sprout, touch a fungus. Otherwise, they don't have the nutrients to survive. All right, so a few further afield items to talk about. So algae and non-vascular plants. So all the plants we've talked about so far are vascular plants, which means they have special tissue in their bodies that lets them conduct water. In the case of the plants we've been talking about, they have tracheids, and some plants don't have tracheids. And in the case of club moss do have tracheids. They're slightly more advanced than some of the other non-vascular plants. But the largest club moss in California is Selagonella Oregona. You'll find this on the north coast, growing on rocks and on tree trunks. It can hang down quite a ways. I've certainly seen strands of this that were 1 meter long or more. I don't know what the maximum is. That's an interesting question as to what the ultimate maximum might be for this plant. You can see here, these little yellow structures are the reproductive structures. These are where the spores of this plant are produced. Selagonella reproduces by spores like ferns. All right, and the biggest algae in California. Anyone got a guess on the biggest algae in California? All right, it's not bull kelp, but it is a kelp, so the giant kelp, Macrocystis parvifera. So the Microcystis perifera, really it can grow as long as it wants to in most cases. It grows in extremely clear water. So before it even makes it to the surface, it is often 40 to 50 meters long. And then once it gets to the surface, it tends to continue growing and gets tangled in these giant mats on the surface. The exact length of those can be hundreds of feet long, so considerably more than 50 meters. Bull kelp is a beautiful plant. Well, actually, it's not a plant at all. For the biologically, esoterically informed amongst the audience, you might be saying it shouldn't be here in the slightest. Not only is bull kelp not a plant, it's not even a regular algae. Algae are a group, the regular algae, as I would call them, the green algae, are a group of plants, or a group of organisms related to the plants. And all of them gained their ability to photosynthesize those little green organs called chloroplasts from bacteria a long time ago. The bull kelp, however, is not amongst that group of animals. In fact, the bull kelp did not gain its chloroplast from bacteria. It stole its chloroplast from algae. So an ancestor of the bull kelp engulfed an algae and did not eat it or digest it, and instead the algae eventually shrunk down to where it was only the chloroplast that was left. So the bull kelp are stealers of their photosynthetic capabilities. All right. And the biggest fungus in California, anyone have a guess? Now, I should say, I shouldn't say biggest fungus. I actually chose this category very specifically, the biggest mushroom in California. Fungi, being filamentous organisms, can extend across the landscape, underground and through tree trunks and in forests. And so the largest fungal organism in the world is in Washington State and covers several square miles. The biggest mushroom in California is a little bit easier to specify. I see someone guessed the lion's mane, and lion's mane can indeed be large. And lion's mane, I think, would be my guess for the largest annual mushroom or non-perennial mushroom. But when it comes to perennial mushrooms, the shelf fungi, specifically the Ganoderma, have everyone else well beaten. So this is a Ganoderma applanatum from Mendocino County. These are perennial mushrooms. So to put that into context, so mushrooms are always live longer. The fungus that produces mushrooms always live a long time. In the case of most mushrooms, you can think of mushrooms like apples. There is an apple tree that exists across many seasons, and then there are individual apples that are produced in the season. Mushrooms are like that as well. There is a mushroom mycelium, a network of threads that exists from season to season and produces mushrooms at different times. In the case of this mushroom, the Ganoderma, it produces a perennial fruiting body. So unlike the mushrooms we eat in salads and see often in the forest, that are ephemeral and come up when it rains and eventually are eaten or decay away. These perennial mushrooms persist, and the mycelium continues to inhabit the mushroom body. And so over time, each time the mycelium is ready and has enough resources to produce reproductive tissue, it will add a new edge to the frill on this mushroom. So you can see this is many seasons worth of growth on this mushroom. This happens to be a particularly large one. They can get even larger. But it's best if you do find something like this in the forest to just leave it be for other people to enjoy. All right. So that ends the official part of my talk. Those are all of the well-defined categories. I want to just end with a little bit of room for food for thought and a seed discussion. So I had some questions myself that I could not find good answers to, and that was part of my picking the low-hanging fruit I mentioned before of not including them in the talk, but I decided to throw them in at the end. And that's things about interesting questions in California, like what might be the longest vine in California? Because of California's Mediterranean climate and because vines tend to grow in the summer months, there isn't a lot of vine diversity in California as compared to many other places. So what might the longest vine in California be? I'm suspicious that poison oak could be a contender here. There are poison oak vines that grow in the redwoods that extend very far up the old growth redwoods that I've seen. Someone guessed ivy in the chat room. Ivy isn't a native to California, but you might be right there. Ivy certainly is another plant that can grow very, very far up into trees. Wild grape, someone else guessed that. Yep, I think that's definitely another contender. Since wild grapes don't grow with sequoia trees or redwoods, they may just not have the chance to get as tall as some of the vines that grow with the redwoods do, but it's an interesting question. The largest annual growth, my candidate for that was guessed earlier by Paul, the bull kelp. Bull kelp is an annual algae that can grow to be 40 or 50 feet tall. So I think it might be the largest annual growth of any plant in California. Wisteria is also not a California native. There are Eastern American species and there are Asian species, but wisteria is not native to California. And when it comes to the heaviest flower, I'm wondering about a heaviest flower. I don't really know this one, but I speculate that it might be the saguaro's flower. It is, and when I say heaviest flower here, I mean the heaviest individual, blossom. Angel's trumpet, that, I think an angel's trumpet would be an interesting question, whether the nightshade, that nightshade from the desert areas could be heavier than a saguaro flower. Saguaro flowers are very fleshy and thick, and they produce a lot of nectar, so I'm just wondering if they might be the heaviest. Pipevine flowers are certainly interesting, but the native California pipevine is not especially large, and so I don't think it would be the heaviest flower, but it is a very fascinating flower. And there are tropical pipevines that are enormous, that are 5 or 6 feet long if you count the spur that extends down from the bottom of the blossom. I don't know if anybody has any other questions, or any arguments they might like to make. If you disagree with something I claimed earlier in the talk, I'm open to debate or enlightenment, as it might be. But feel free to ask your questions. I'm looking at the chat or the question and answer. So. All right. And this is all the images that I used in the show. So if anybody wanted to return to any of the images, they can certainly do so. You can ask about that in the room. Manroot can get to be enormous. The largest one is the one that arched over the entrance to the Botanical Garden in Southern California. And that one, I believe, weighed about 600 pounds. It wasn't entirely intact. It had been removed from the ground, and several of the portions of the root had been left in the ground when it was removed. All right, so the aspens in Utah, Pondo. So if you look up Pondo on Google, you can learn lots about it. It's a very interesting plant. Sadly, it seems to be that the climate change may be adversely affecting it, and it may not. It may be shrinking now. But here's the image of that. Pondo, as I said, it covers, I believe, about 200 acres in Utah where it grows. All right. Dodder is an interesting plant. It might compete in, dodder is, they're so ephemeral and tiny, the vines of dodder, so I don't know that it would have a superlative. It certainly might be the longest vine parasite in California, since I think it's the only vine parasite in California. Let's see. The largest parasite, I'll go back to Crameria. So that's Crameria californica. And it is a bush. Oops. Let me go back to the images. Yeah, there we go. That's the bloom of Crameria and the seedlings of Crameria. It's a desert shrub. That Utah aspen is estimated to be about 80,000 years old. Unlike some trees where we can, take a wood sample and actually count the age of the tree and have an exact answer, when it comes to a tree like a quaking aspen, especially a clonal tree like this. There have been many individual trunks of this tree. The organism itself is the thing that is old. So there isn't an individual trunk we can measure, but estimating by the growth rate of the tree and the size of it and the climate in the area, it's speculated that Pondo could be about 80,000 years old. And the most endangered plant, that would be a very good question. There are certainly trees, the Port Orford cedar in California, for instance, it only grows in a few spots high in the mountains, and it is being attacked by the sudden oak death Phytophthora pathogen. Interestingly enough, Phytophthora is another group of organisms very closely related to the kelp that we talked about earlier. It's an organism that also stole a chloroplast from an algae, but in this case it lost it again and has now gone back to being a parasite. Raven's manzanita is a good suggestion for the rarest plant in California. I think there's only one of those, one natural representative of that left, maybe two. There are a few different manzanitas that certainly, manzanitas and manzanita subspecies. I have to confess there's probably more manzanita species than there need to be, but certainly people would debate me on that. And so a few of those are individual single manzanitas that they're the only representatives that we know of. The bristlecone pine is the oldest anywhere. That is definitely true. There are both, the oldest tree that was ever felled of a bristlecone was randomly sampled and turned out to be the oldest one ever. And sadly, that tree was killed when it was sampled. Scientists have cored another tree that was, and so that tree I believe was, I want to say it was 5,700 years old. Scientists have cores of another tree that was 5,600 years old, but these days the oldest living bristlecone is probably around 4,500 years old. I'm not sure the park and the Palo Alto bay laurel in the park, if you just Google largest bay laurel in California, you can find it very quickly. And the aspen tree, so at the beginning of the talk, I talked about clonal and non-clonal trees. And I'll move over to the question and answer section in just a second. Let me finish this one here. And if people would ask their questions in the Q&A room now, so I don't have to pay attention to both, I'll shift over from the chat. Thanks everyone for who's attended and isn't asking a question. So at the beginning of the talk, I talked about clonal and non-clonal trees. So in the case of Pondo being 80,000 years old, the organism itself is 80,000 years old. But with trees, that doesn't mean that a single trunk, a single crown with a set of branches and leaves has existed that long. So there's a difference between clonal trees like the quaking aspen and the banyan and some other long-lived trees, and trees like a sequoia or a redwood where an individual trunk with branches and leaves has been in existence for that time. So when we talk about the oldest bristlecone, that bristlecone has had a trunk and branches and leaves for that 4,500 years. Continuously, and it's the same one that we can see today. In the case of Pondo, any individual branch or trunk that you see in the large organism that is Pondo isn't any older than a couple of hundred years. But it's an interesting question. There are many vegetative organisms, plants of all kinds that can be extremely long-lived if we take into account how old the plant is in terms of how long it's been growing since it started from a seed. And so that includes bushes and trees. Redwoods regenerate from their stumps. So there could be definitely extremely old trees, even older than the redwoods and the sequoias that we know about. All right. All right, prevalence of tannic acids in trees and redwoods. Yeah, so tannic acid is certainly one of the things that trees produce to protect themselves from organisms and to prevent decay. Redwoods and sequoias have much more than that. They have a variety of phenolic compounds that conifers especially are good at producing. And these are resinous-y compounds, are what give pine trees that distinctive smell. And they also are protective compounds. So in the case of redwoods and sequoias, they have their own set of these compounds that aren't like the ones found in other trees. You know, if you ever were to cut into a redwood or sequoia or see those trees, you'll notice that they're not sappy like a lot of other conifers and pine trees are. So they have their own distinctive set of these materials, but they obviously protect the trees quite well. All right, what conifer had the cone that can, and how the bark can grow around it? The closed cone pines, and so that can be Pinus radiata, bishop pine, Monterey pine. They can hold on to their cones, and the cones can end up being overgrown by the branches or the trunks around them. So there's several different species in California that can do that. Dodder is stringy and orange because it doesn't have chlorophyll like most other plants, and so what you're seeing is just the color of its tissue without the green that you normally see in plants covering that up. I'm not exactly particularly sure why it's orange. It's stringy because it's a vine, but I don't know why it's orange. That's an interesting question. As far as how long it takes for those trees to decay, that's, it really depends. In the right circumstances, with a lot of oxygen and moisture, even a redwood or sequoia can decay quite rapidly. Even a resistant piece of wood, if it has proper oxygen and moisture, is going to be, eaten by something. But there's certainly downed redwood stumps and downed pieces of bristlecone that are thousands of years old. They have been dated by the tree rings in the wood and then cross-dated amongst other things. So it's pretty interesting as far as that goes. Are some of the trees that can clone be hypothetically immortal? Yeah, indeed. It's entirely possible that, for instance, some of the redwood trees we see today in the North Coast and some of the areas that have a very stable climate might be the same organism as the ones that came out from the last ice age. Since redwoods can stump sprout. In the case of other trees, though, they can't be immortal, like a giant sequoia, for instance. They can't stump sprout. So once their trunk is damaged by lightning or they fall over from a storm, they can't grow additional trunks after that. And so a giant sequoia, even though an individual tree may be able to live for 3,000 or 4,000 years, eventually, most likely because they live up in the mountains, the land beneath them will erode away and they will fall over and they can't regenerate. But redwoods, however, definitely could potentially be like that. Likewise, there are other trees in California. Buckeyes can regenerate from the ground. One of the smaller trees in California, elderberry, can also regenerate from its stump. And so elderberries in California could be also extremely old. We'd have no way of knowing it because they don't have persistent material for us to date to be able to know. But yeah, there could be lots of hidden, extremely old plants of all kinds in California. That can include grasses, lots of different plants that have persistent organs like rhizomes or stumps or bulbs. Could be of arbitrary age. It's fascinating to imagine what some of the oldest things in the plant world are that we're just unaware of. All right, I think that's the end of the questions. Thanks everybody for attending. I had a great time. I hope you did too. Please keep well in the pandemic and get outside and enjoy nature 6 feet apart with masks on. Thanks everybody.
Yep, thank you so much. This has been wonderful. Everyone, thank you so much for being here. We'll see you all September 3rd for Jonathan Young looking at urban renewal in nature. Kip, thank you so much. This was wonderful. Hope to get you for yet another opportunity for you to share your knowledge with us.
I'd love to.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
All right, bye.